In this module, we look at historical and cultural issues that somebody considering property investment analysis should be very aware of. Normally, you won't find these topics in a textbook on property investment or investment in general. And that's because finance tends to focus very narrowly on the mathematics and the theories of how securities move their values and how corporations organize themselves. But their really weak spot is that investment is all about making estimates of what's going to happen in the future. And as we saw last week, this rather troublesome assumption that the future is going to be like the past. What I want to do is run past you the last half century or so and show that in that last century, maybe particularly, maybe not, there have been so many changes that have made the future for any decade very unlike the decade before or the century before. In some cases, very unlike the entire history of the Western culture for the last half millennia. We've been through huge changes in the West. We're seeing that now a little. We seem to be becoming very comfortable with cultural change, with people changing major values, things that were absolutely taboo even 10 or 20 years ago, are now not only commonplace, but mandated, and opposition to them carries penalties with the force of law. It's almost as though our whole culture is being turned upside down. You can't turn a culture upside down without influencing the way that property is utilised, especially when we look at residential property, because residential property has to do with the way that households work. And households, until recently, were primarily collections of people within that quaint term, the family. It turns out that the family has been relatively stable probably for most of the last couple of thousand years, up until about 50 or 60 years ago, when families started to change and change regularly. Families got smaller, households acquired a greater number of incomes, and there was or has been a tendency to move from seeing the family home as a place of unity, a place of stability, a place to bring up a family, whereas now the household is simply a collection of individuals, most of whom will have independent incomes. The notion of a house is far more of an investment now than a place to use, in the same way you might use a pair of socks and comfortably wear it out, or you might use a motor car and even be inclined to change it to suit yourself. Now, if we change our real estate assets, we do it with the investment potential, the investment effects, the capital gain perhaps, as part of our object. That quite changes things. Those changes have made some people wealthy, made some people poorer. It has changed the way that households work and think. In the commercial area, we've also seen major changes over the last half century. In 1950 or even 1960 or 1970, Australia was a major industrial manufacturer. We were leaders in many areas of manufacturing. We made everything from computers to pianos to shoes to food, cigarettes. Now we don't. Even our food is largely, in fact, for a primary producing country, surprisingly dominated by imports. Major change that will affect rural properties. Commercial properties, retailing properties are changing because of the difference in balance between industrial land and commercial land. Retailing is becoming a major employer, whereas it was previously only a minor player. All of these changes have happened since about 1970. What that means is that we have to understand the impacts of the changes on property investment, and the life and future of individuals. We're now seeing a very subtle but very real war on the motor car beginning. And so in the 1960s, when cars were becoming cheaper and more plentiful, in the 1970s, when that was even more so people were tending to have double garages in their larger homes, now we're having smaller garages. Many people live in situations where they don't have a garage at all or don't expect to own a motor car. A major change in the way that we live. In the regions, we can see that whereas we used to have a smattering of good-sized towns, we'll call them regional cities, roughly about an hour drive from each other, all across the more settled parts of regional Australia. Now we're seeing that those regional cities, some of them are growing, a relatively small number, most of them are shrinking. If they don't have some industrial or mining connection, and for most the industrial connections are not proving to be so robust, they tend to be shrinking. I was looking at the north coast, the far north coast of New South Wales recently, and there are 3 cities, roughly an hour's drive from each other: Coffs Harbour, Grafton and Lismore. Each was a thriving independent city with its own retailing base, its own administrative base, its own manufacturing base. But the residents from Grafton discovered after a while that for their entertainment, for their shopping, even to buy a new car, an hour's drive up the road to Lismore or down the road to Coffs Harbour ended up with better deals, more interesting restaurants. And so Grafton now is to a certain extent in eclipse. We could point to other cities as well. Lithgow comes to mind. Across New South Wales, as an example, we see that Dubbo is thriving. Bathurst Orange is not doing too badly, and Wagga. But many of the other cities have shrunk to the point where they're hardly significant at all. And so this concentration is also important. When we look at the way the property markets work, we forget that the headline numbers, the numbers that tend to get into reports and national property commentaries and so on, tend to be from the capital cities, from the CBDs in capital cities, if we're talking commercial. It's as though regional Australia hardly is noticed. And so if we sit back and learn about negative gear strategies and other approaches to investment, even just the idea of owning an investment property might be more affordable if you invest in a smaller town. But is it going to be effective as an investment? It's really a matter of looking very closely at the situation. Somebody investing, for instance, in Grafton would be enjoying a completely different result today compared to investing in Lismore or Coffs Harbour. And all of those are really following completely different trajectories to Sydney. So understanding these forces, the way that households have changed, our approach to debt has changed, the number of incomes has changed. There are a number of resources in this week's module that I recommend that you look at. I found discovering Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two Income Trap, particularly interesting. I've been doing a fair bit of work in this general area as a property economist. She came to the topic from the point of view of the law because she was concerned, in fact appalled, by the level of domestic bankruptcy. Ordinary people, wages and salary people, who found themselves in bankruptcy. Bankruptcy was previously the forte for businessmen. What was going on? Warren found that the development of double income households, which is largely a creature of the 1970s, perhaps into the 1980s, now pretty much universal, greatly increased the risks of economic financial collapse for the average household. In 2006, which is now getting to be a few years ago, Warren was surprised that in her country, the United States, household bankruptcy was more common than divorce. And even though both are dreadful and painful, nobody talks about household bankruptcy. And the reason is that it is such an embarrassment. Somehow the embarrassment of having your family come apart is now considered more socially acceptable than the embarrassment, the humiliation of being unsuccessful financially. That in itself is a sad indictment into the values that we now have in our culture. And Warren was able to investigate the economic side of it. And I do recommend that if you have time, watch her presentation. It's an excellent presentation on this process, this change, and I think you may find it quite surprising. There have been other authors, academics, writers who have looked at this issue as well. Warren, the book, The Two-Income Trap, not The Two-Income Trap, Affluenza is representative. These changes have challenged the way that we understand culture and the stability behind our economy. And I think as students of property investment, these major changes are things which you really need to take very, very seriously, especially if you live and work in regional Australia, or if you have a love for regional Australia, or even if you have a love for culture. Because one way or another, you can't change culture without it affecting many, many things, a long way away from simply how you arrange your personal affairs. I hope you find this module of interest. I hope it encourages you to look further into this fascinating area. And even professionally, I hope that it stimulates, an interest in your investigation into things as distant as immigration policy, taxation policy, maybe even family law, and consider their implications for your possible work in financial advice, in property investment evaluation, and in fact any area where society meets property and other investments.